Welcome to Educate, Inform, and Challenge. My name is Teresa MacLennan. I'm Executive Director of the Women and Children's Shelter of Barrie. We truly appreciate that you, our viewers, are coming alongside us as we really talk about and dive into the lives and experiences of women in our community, gender equity, women in politics, and of course, we do talk about violence and oppression. And so again, thank you so much for being with us. Before we begin, we do want to acknowledge our Indigenous community. We thank you for your culture, your history, your knowledge, and we thank you so much for allowing us to share in this space and to have these conversations. Thank you. Before we begin our conversation today, there are some topics that we talk about that may be sensitive and triggering to our community. We always want to be very, very aware of that. We want our listeners, our viewers, to think about their self-care and their wellness. So today may be one of those topics, and we just want everyone to know that. Please step away if you feel that you need to. It is good with us, and we want you to be well. So today I am thrilled to introduce Emily MacIntosh, and I'm going to let Emily introduce herself and the multiple hats that she wears, and then we're going to dive into some of the incredible work that Emily is doing right here in our community. So welcome, Emily. So glad you could be with us here today.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine. Thanks so much.
So I know you wear multiple hats, Emily. Do you want to just kind of give our viewers a sense of all of those?
Sure. So formally, in my professional life, I'm the Executive Director of Contact Community Services. We are a social service agency in South Simcoe. So we work with people experiencing homelessness or who are at risk. We are the Housing Resource Centre for South Simcoe. We run an Employment Ontario office out of Bradford, West Gwillimbury. We also have 2 social enterprise stores, the Clothesline, to provide free and affordable goods to community. And we have a number of other community programs. So that's my whatever 9 to however many hours of the day hat, and then yes, I'm a mother of 2 small children. So if I miss some words in today's interview, then I'll blame my son because we haven't slept for 2 years. But those are the hats that I wear. And then on a personal note, have always identified as a feminist and really been motivated to try to assist. It sounds so cheesy, but it is absolutely true in making the world and the communities that we live in a better place to be. And I'm so grateful because I've done so much learning and listening in the past few years, and I really look forward to continuing that as well.
Well, that is incredible. And your advocacy and social justice hat, let's call it, is of course right in line with the work that we do here in our Women and Children's Shelter in terms of our violence prevention program and our Women's Advocacy Council, who we focus a lot of attention on those injustices that are happening. And so I want to dive right into one in particular. And I really want to just create the floor for you to talk about that so people can really understand what's happening. So you identified that there are, I'm going to use the word discrepancies and not enough action being taken in terms of provincial and municipal leaders, political leaders, in how they are handling and conducting themselves in terms of violence and harassment in the workplace. So can you start off first telling us why is this an important topic to you?
Someone else asked me this question because I've been doing so much outreach around this, and it's personal to me because I'm a woman, and I want to know that if I am harassed, that there's going to be appropriate recourse and that any person could be removed from their position if those acts were considered egregious. So what we're looking for is there is a lack of consistency as far as expectations around how we treat each other. And when it comes to municipally elected officials, there is a gap in legislation where these officials are not accountable to violence and harassment in the workplace policies. And that is not acceptable. It's wrong.
Yeah. And I really appreciate what you're saying because what's always resonated with me is, as a nonprofit agency, we have very strict report backs that have to be done to our funders. We have very strict policies and procedures that have to be followed. And in the nonprofit sector in particular, there is a very large lens on how nonprofit agencies of all kinds conduct themselves. We are all highly accountable for having policies that address violence and harassment in the workplace, mental wellness for employees, a wide gamut. And as EDs, we are accountable and responsible to ensuring that those policies and procedures are developed and that they're implemented and that we report back on those. And so it for nonprofit agencies and social service agencies, that high standard that we need to have. But in the greater community, if we think about businesses, if we think about our municipal and provincial leaders, that same degree of accountability does not exist. And would you agree in me saying that?
Certainly, I know in 2018, the government provincially mandated businesses to have violence and harassment in the workplace policies. And then, yes, you see a wide range of sort of that standard. And then, of course, you can have the policy developed, but how much is it implemented? That can range sector to sector. However, when that legislation was introduced, there was an oversight, a gross oversight, where that is not applicable to municipally elected officials because their boss is, I think, considered the people. And so there was actually legislation that was introduced. It started out as Bill 260, and then Parliament was prorogued, and then it was reintroduced as Bill 10. And it was called the Stopping Harassment and Abuse by Local Leaders Act. It was introduced by Stephen Blaise, and that was to try and create that consistency, because we are talking about basic workplace safety. Before we even talk about, diversity, equity, inclusion, if you do not feel safe in your workplace, you cannot perform your job. Community safety is something that we all need to play a role in, and that's why I'm, using the municipal election with a team of people, organizations, and community groups to raise awareness of this issue.
So I want to dive into what is now Bill 5. But before before we want to hear more about that, what is your thoughts in terms of the majority of who people are that are experiencing, let's say, violence and sexual harassment in the workplace? Male, female?
I think the research would support that women are adversely affected, and we know this. There was Angus Reid Institute in 2018 did produce a report that I believe the statistic is 52% of women have experienced harassment in the workplace, and another 28% sexual harassment. And when I say women, I'm also, of course, speaking of individuals who are non-binary and trans women as well. And what's wild is that's just what we're hearing about. And if people in the community are hearing about instances of harassment, that's likely tip of the iceberg, because we know this is so underreported.
And what we know from our agency perspective, of course, we take a gender-based lens to all violence and harassment, sexual assaults, right? And from a feminist perspective. And what we believe and we wrap our services around is an understanding about the imbalance of power that exists between primarily men and women. And we know that it is still very much a male dominated in terms of supervisory management roles. And so it can be a power over the employees, right? But there's also this feeling for women, and we hear this a lot from women. I just felt like I just had to try and do what I had to do because I wanted my job. And I really felt like I was going to lose my job, and he was making life very difficult for me in my workplace if I didn't let him kind of hold my hand or rub my back when he was talking to me. And so we understand that as women from that feminist perspective about how most of us as women have needed to move through life and move through the world that has predominantly been very male dominated. And so I think that's just the backdrop to just for our viewers to have that understanding again of what it's like to be a woman, and how we maneuver through life is very different than how it is for men. A good example, I'm just going to add, when I am going to walk somewhere in the evening time, I have a greater degree of thinking about my safety when I do that, probably and most likely compared to any man that is going for a walk at the same time. Mm-hmm. So we as women need to think about different things. And that also includes, how do we survive in the workplace? How do we get ahead? Mm-hmm. And how do we do that with the potential of that harassment that can be happening in our workplace? Mm-hmm. So we are going to take a very quick break, and then we're going to come back and we are going to dive into the nuts and bolts of what Bill 5 is, so that we can understand it. And we're going to talk about how the community can become involved, and really, why does the community need to care about this? And so we're going to really dive into those conversations. Please, our viewers, stay with us. This is an important conversation for us to take part in, and we will be back as soon as we are done our commercial. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
I started playing softball when I was 5 years old. I loved it because it was all about having fun with my friends. And it still is.
From little kids to adults to seniors, softball is a sport for everyone. Join us.
So welcome back to Educate, Inform, and Challenge. And we're going to dive right back in with our discussion with my friend Emily. We're going to talk about Bill 5. And so, Emily, I really want to give you the floor. So let's talk about what Bill 5 is and what is the intent behind it.
Okay, so Bill 5 has been introduced by private member Stephen Blaise, and it's called Stopping Harassment and Abuse by Local Leaders Act. And the gist of this legislation is that it would hold municipally elected and board member officials to violence and harassment in the workplace policies. This is so fundamental. Honestly, as I'm speaking about it, it's very, I can't actually believe that we're spending time talking about this, because every single other person who's employed in this province is held to this standard. So this is what this bill would do. In addition to that, it would allow municipalities to direct an integrity commissioner to apply to the courts to actually have a municipally elected official removed if it was substantiated that there were egregious acts of harassment. Right now, the only consequence is 3 months without pay, and that's not acceptable.
And that 3 months without pay, is that a given? Or is there still seem like there's a little bit of gray area if that actually happens?
It's all up. My understanding is it's all up to the integrity commissioner, what is found there. And then there's discretion as to what that looks like. But it's just not enough teeth to help either prevent acts of harassment and certainly to have consequences to acts of harassment in the workplace and in the community. And in particular, municipal officials, their workplace is everywhere. And they have incredible decision-making power. They already have natural deference because of the power differential, which is exactly why this gap in legislation is so unacceptable.
And so my understanding again is this is at the provincial level, but it would be at the provincial level that makes it mandatory at the municipal level.
Correct. Yeah, and it's very interesting because as we've been having conversations around Bill 5, some of the responses I've heard from various individuals is, well, that's provincial. So, just, go to your MPP. But my response to that is we all have a role to play in workplace safety and making sure that people are not harassed or sexually assaulted at work. We all have a role to play in that. And very fascinating to me because when we're looking at candidates running municipally, that's their workplace. We all have a role in making sure that other people are safe and that we ourselves are safe. If I see a crime being committed on the street and the police don't see it, I still report it because that's part of what we do as community members. And so that's a big piece around this legislation. It's provincial, but in my experience, members of provincial parliament perk up and listen and enact change when they think that you, the voter, cares.
So I'm going to assume that there is some level at municipal politics of having policies and procedures related to violence and harassment. So prior to this bill coming in, what do you think the problem has been in terms of those policies and procedures not being followed through and appropriate recourse happening to the perpetrators and supports for the victims?
Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm just
a big question. Yeah.
And I really want to be careful around my level of expertise. So I'm only speaking from my layperson understanding here for the viewers' benefit, is that each municipality has their own violence and harassment in the workplace policies. The issue, from my understanding, is that that's not where there's problems. It's that elected officials are not held accountable to that. And legally, they are not held accountable to that. All municipalities, to my understanding, do have an integrity commissioner, or they can bring in an outside investigator. Municipalities have usually a time frame when a claim needs to be filed. So that's something to consider. But then, you have examples where if something wasn't filed on time, their council is casting votes as to whether or not there's going to be permission for that claim to be investigated, for example. And so sometimes, what you might consider as a no-brainer for something to be investigated may actually be overridden by elected official votes. Certainly the current system is not perfect, and having this legislation is not going to make it perfect. But it will certainly increase the accountability and hopefully make that more transparent. And I think just by having these conversations is really critical for people to realize that this is why it's so important that it is provincially mandated.
Do you know, and I appreciate, the expertise, not expertise in the field, right? But you're a concerned woman and the work that you're doing is incredible. So of course, I was going to ask you some questions, and if you don't know, that's okay. But do you know or have a sense of if there is a investigation report that comes from an integrity commissioner, that it would still at the municipal level be voted on by those municipal leaders whether or not to adopt the recommendations that were brought forward by the integrity commissioner?
Well, that's a great question. And I am going to hope that Bill 5 covers that because, if that can be overridden by municipally elected officials, then that's problematic.
Yeah. And I think that, in our own communities and for our viewers, you may be able to think about some instances or some things that have come to light that really make you question what those processes have been. And that accountability, right? Just right here in our own community. The conversation is so important because we need to ask the questions, and we as voters need to hold our elected, politicians accountable. And I think I want to ask you about how do we create movement of support for Bill 5? What do we need to do?
Okay. Thank you very much. So there's a few initiatives happening. So some of the viewers may have heard of the Women of Simcoe Say No. This is pretty much enacted in the last, 3 weeks. And it's not just for women or for people who identify as female or non-binary. This is for everybody to participate in, because again, we all have that role to play in creating safe communities. We have a demonstration that's happening at Barrie City Hall next Wednesday, or I guess this upcoming Wednesday, September 21st at 6:30. There will be some signage there to raise awareness. Anybody can reach out and is encouraged to reach out to their MPP, because ultimately that is where the change is going to happen, through voters advocating that this is important to them. There's a number of deputations that are taking place across the county of Simcoe. We have almost every single municipality covered. And again, it's the Women of Simcoe Say No, and we will be asking each council to endorse this legislation and write a letter of support to Premier Doug Ford, all local MPPs, and private member Stephen Blaise. Anybody can tweet about the issue. Bill 5, let's pass it now. You can share the graphic along with the Women of Simcoe Say No. And I certainly myself have invited Doug Ford to attend the demonstration, and I'm encouraging him and his colleagues to actually announce that they will pass this legislation. So there's no shortage of ways to get involved. And at a very basic level, have the conversation with other people, because so many people are scared that if they're not experts on legislation, they can't make change or they can't speak about it. But if you, at a basic level, believe that if someone is harassed, that they should be held accountable, that is all you need to know. We let the politicians make sure that the legislation covers all the gaps. We only have to voice what we want as a community, and to never forget that our elected representatives are just that. We elect them and they represent our voice.
So can you walk us through the process? Let's just get educated about this. How does a bill get passed, and then how does it get implemented?
Okay, so there are normally 3 readings. So a first reading, a second reading, and a third. And then at that time, it will then receive royal assent. And again, I am not an expert, but I know that it's brought to the floor, it's introduced, it's reviewed, and then there's discussion. It might go to a committee for further review. Interestingly, this bill, as Bill 10, had all party support. So I think the real question is, why was it not prioritized? And if it was prioritized, maybe we wouldn't have people running in this province for re-election. And I think that is something to really think about, and is incredibly frustrating, is that we had this bill on the floor, and maybe our situation would be looking quite different. So that's why we are asking the provincial government to pass it now, because we are going to have new councillors, we are going to have new leaders in this community, and we want to make sure that they are accountable to their actions.
How do you think that any experiences for women in particular, violence and harassment in the workplace, will influence their desire to seek out running in municipal politics?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it doesn't happen. I think, nobody wants to go into a workplace that they don't feel safe in. I mean, that is so fundamental. It's such a fundamental principle to being able to do your job. And so, years ago, I was part of it was like a Women in Politics running manual. And I was thinking about it recently with this advocacy, because if you don't have workplace safety, then you're not going to have women involved at the elected level. And I think the other thing to think about too is how stifled are women's voices within caucus. We still know that women are so underrepresented. So what does that look like? I mean, how many women in caucus currently have actually been advocating for this bill? I would love to know. Lots of members of the public would love to know, because if they have been, we want to be able to support that, because women need to be supporting women, because all people need to be supporting women.
And we know, and we encourage, and we ask for the voices of men. because women have been talking about what we need and the movement that needs to happen for years and years. But we recognize that the voice of men is equally important because men will listen to other men. And we want men to be role models about what is equitable in our world. And so we've got about 5 minutes left. I have just a couple more quick questions. There's been so much fulsome, great information today, Emily. How should people be thinking about their vote in the upcoming municipal election?
Great question. We want you to be asking your candidates what they have done to support Bill 5. I would encourage you to do personal research as to that candidate's history in their community to make sure that their behavior of what is known aligns with your own values, and also to ask them what they will do should they be elected. We have a majority government provincially. There is no reason this can't get passed before October 24th. Government can pass legislation when it wants, and if there's a majority, it can happen very quickly. So I would encourage everyone to be having those conversations, because when people are running municipally, when they start speaking about that, it is going to get the attention of MPPs. And again, it's their workplace and it's your community. So that's what I would share.
I think it's wonderful. And again, what is the time frame? Because is there a time crunch for us to be tweeting and posting and attending rallies and writing letters? What is that time frame that we really need to be working within?
I would say the time is now. Everyone has personal reasons and life that comes up as to why they can or cannot get involved. But it is as simple as sharing the Women of Simcoe Say No, the demonstration. It's about showing up. It's about sharing it with your friends and family. It's talking about it. We want to do this now so that there is pressure on the province to pass this legislation, because once the elections happen, often life goes back to normal, but that status quo is not okay for women now. It's not okay for anyone now. If this legislation is passed, not only do women benefit, we know that when we do things with women in mind, every person benefits. It's the same across the board as far as application of the legislation. So the time is now. Please tweet about Bill 5, hashtag the Women of Simcoe Say No. Anything that you can do, write a letter to the press, circulate the letter that you want to write to other people that you know to get their signature. There are so many ways that you can get your voice out. And again, you don't need to be an expert. You just need to know what you're accountable to in your workplace and ask for the same from our municipally elected officials.
When the previous bill was being proposed, as a women's council and agency, we wrote letters and sent them to all levels of our municipal partners. And it was unfortunate to see that there was some buy-in and some wanting to really support it, and others saying, well, that's not my level of government. Mm-hmm. And again, everyone has a voice, everyone has influence. Mm-hmm. And so we want our viewers to recognize that you have a great voice and you have a great deal of influence, even if you don't feel that all the time. Mm-hmm. Social media, where you live, mm-hmm. the groups you're connected to, your family and friends. Mm-hmm. Start to talk about what a safe workplace looks like for everyone. We are just so supportive of this bill. And Emily, so incredibly supportive of all of the wonderful work that you are doing. I truly hope that our viewers today have felt inspired by you. Please get involved with C5, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.